Welcome to My Best Save, the podcast where the world's top surgeons reveal their most extraordinary moment in the operating room. Get ready for gripping stories of life-saving maneuvers that defy the odds. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Nikfarjam, a board-certified plastic surgeon in New York City. Discover the secret to surgical heroics that become legendary educational cases. See you in a stitch. Okay, my people, welcome to My Best Save, the podcast that highlights our healthcare heroes and the amazing stories they have of saving people's lives. I am back, Dr. Jeremy Nikfarjam, plastic surgeon right here in New York. Where do we leave off? Residency. Now, first day of residency and the first year of residency is called your intern year. Intern year is probably one of the most monumental, probably the most monumental moment of a young doctor's career, no matter what specialty they go into, because their lives will never be the same ever again. How do I summarize this in a better way? You will forever be devoting your life to helping others and to society and to a population as a whole, and you will never get that back ever again. So you're embarking on a journey where there is no return, where you will never be the same again. First day of my intern year, I will never forget that moment. I'll never forget the feeling and what it was like. 5:30 a.m., we come to the hospital, meet on the 10th floor ICU for morning rounds. Now, I start off doing general surgery, which is literally general surgery of almost the whole body, but you're dealing with very sick patients. 3 interns and a chief resident come to rounds. We meet there at 5:30 and we're waiting and waiting and waiting. And time goes along, brand new scrubs, new white coat, new Calzero shoes, new scrubs. I mean, we're fresh, gelled hair, ready to go. Little did we know. Chief resident strolls in, 5:45. No hello, no how are you, no what is your name. He starts with, let's go, we're late. We go, the way rounds work, you go from room to room to room, visiting patients up to about 30 to 60 seconds a patient, rapid fire of information, and you have to make now plans for the whole day in a matter of seconds. So we go from first room, patient who had bowel perforation, exploratory laparotomy, incision made down the abdomen, open up the man's belly, fix the bowel perforation, wash out the abdomen, and now is in critical care and septic shock, meaning the patient's on blood pressure medication support and air breathing machine support to support their blood pressure so that they honestly don't die. And patients could be extremely sick. This patient was extremely sick. That was the first patient, 60 seconds. The next room we walked into was a patient with a cold foot. Patient came in diabetic, hypertensive, obese, who had a blood clot in the femoral artery of the leg, needed an emergent catheterization, embolization, and removal of this clotted artery done through an open incision because the foot was turning blue or becoming cold, as we say, and not getting arterial blood supply. Patient underwent operation and thrombectomy performed. We then had to manage the patient on blood thinners. And what can happen to patients in this scenario is their legs can swell up so bad it can actually constrict and choke the vessel that we actually tried to save, called the compartment syndrome. So a patient was being managed on a blood thinner and rule out compartment syndrome with really oozing coming from all parts of his wound because he's on blood thinners. Next patient was a perforated appendectomy and appendicitis that did not come in on time and basically ruptured and exploded, making the patient sick, requiring IV antibiotics, hydration, and hospitalization in an ICU. And this list went on and on. We started in the ICU, went down to the step-down unit, which is like a mini ICU, and then the floors. 40 patients in less than an hour on our first day at work. After rounds were done, chief resident got us in a huddle and spent about 4 minutes going over the plan. Patient A, patient B, patient C, 40 patients worth of plans lined up for these patients in rapid sequence fire, where we furiously wrote notes, ready to go. And the second that huddle was done, at 7:01 a.m., the chief resident peeled away with an intern, went to the operating room, and left me and my co-intern alone to manage our first day. So our chief resident is off. We're left alone. I'm standing next to my brand new co-intern whom I met 45 minutes to an hour before this actual moment. I looked at this young doctor and I say to her, okay, well, we have these patients. How should we divide up the tasks? And she looks at me in a way that she can't understand almost a single thing I'm saying. And I repeat, which patients do you want? Which patients should I have? Or let me just assign them to you and let's move along. And she looks at me even more strange. And I say to her, I'm like, what is your name? She doesn't know what I'm talking about. I then realize, through several more questions, that my co-intern was a lady, a female doctor that came from China the day before residency began, must be a brilliant doctor, best of the best, one of a kind, I'm sure, to travel so far to gain American training, but didn't speak a word of English. Intern day, my first day. And I say to her, you know what, doc? You go put in IVs and deal with the technical things with our patients that need those things, blood draws, IVs, wound dressings. I'll do the rest. And this is the first day of feeling alone. So we send her off. I'm at the computer, got my hands stretched, logging in, go through my list of what needs to be done. And as I'm putting orders in the computer, I realize, it dawns on me, I've never put an order in before. I mean, as a medical student, yes, I can interpret labs. Yes, I can read other providers' notes. I can make sense. I can synthesize information. But I've never put in an order. And it must have been really obvious because as I'm sitting there looking around and wandering with myself, I realized that there are some people around who realize that I'm lost. So I look left, right, up and down, and I realize, yes, a nurse comes by. This angelic, amazing, helpful, almost opportune moment nurse comes in and says to me, Dr. Nikfarjam, do you need help putting in orders? And I look at her and I say, yes, I do, please. And she says, okay, let's go over your orders. What do you need to be done? And I'm like, well, this patient needs potassium. And she goes, well, how much potassium do you want to order? And I'm like, I need to calculate. She goes, why don't we start with 10 milliequivalents? That's a low dose, and let's see where to go from there. And I'm like, yes, I agree with you. What does your next patient need? Well, they need a morphine order. Let's start with 2 milligrams and go from there. And this went on and on and on for 40 patients. What many, I think, people in the public don't realize is that in the young phase of a career of a young doctor and young surgeon, doctors don't train each other at a young stage. Actually, the nurses do. Nurses are an integral role in who we are in our young development because they hold our hand. They guide us. They make sure we don't do anything utterly stupid. And they actually are extremely patient with our growth. So I will never, ever not remember those moments where I knew nothing and there was that angelic nurse available to teach me what needed to be done. I will forever be grateful to those nurses who taught me. So this day goes by, orders are going in, chaos erupts, and as the evening comes around, the chief resident somehow surfaces from underground in the OR. And he comes to this moment not realizing how many fires I had to put out on my first day. That patient with exploratory laparotomy crashing on the ICU, blood pressure dropping, had to call critical care in to help, had to review lactate orders, titrate up the pressor support. That patient with a cold leg was developing leg swelling, needed more elevation. I had to titrate up and change that heparin order to thin out their blood as I'm worried for that compartment syndrome. And this went on and on all day. Patients' blood pressures, heart rates, pain statuses, inability to kind of function just became worse throughout the day. And the craziest part is that you are all alone and there is no help. So as the chief resident came out of the operating room and he says, let's round. We once again duplicate those morning rounds in a faster sequence from the ICU to step down unit to the floors, patient by patient, room by room, all 40 patients done. And the craziest part, 6:30 p.m. after rounds are performed, we have a whole new chapter of orders that come in that have to be done before we go home. put in IVs, draw labs, create these orders, change those dressings, get the patient prepared and ready for a surgery the next day, and do those post-op checks. A post-op check is when a patient comes out of the operating room, making sure that they're alive and well and the plan's enacted. All had to be done before we left home. So even though rounds were at 6:30 and the chief resident went home, guess who was there till 9 o'clock, tucking in patients, making sure orders were done, and interns did not go home until your tasks were complete. Strict orders, and that's the culture. And that was all on day one. So days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months almost became the entirety of intern year. Interesting parts of intern I thought were amazing in that the days went by so quickly that by the time you looked up, they were over. Cut. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned into the year, which completed the intern year. Intern year, in summary, was about one thing and one thing only: survival. Not just patient survival, because our jobs were to make sure and ensure that the patient survived, but also survival of you as the intern. Many interns didn't make it. Many of them couldn't, kind of handle that surgical intern year. But the goal was the same: survive, get through it, and move on. Every hour, every day, every call, every week, every month, every year. And calls were every third day. We're on call overnight for 24 hours. There was no mercy. There was no, hey, I'm not feeling well. It was Q3 the whole entire year. I'll never forget what it was like where you felt like you knew nothing. And every day was a challenge, being, almost submerged underwater with just having your nostrils above that peak of water. You couldn't breathe, but you can surface for enough air to kind of go below water for as long as you needed to. Almost like drowning without fully drowning. Now, I'll never forget the day where I thought to myself, well, how do I know what I'm doing? How do I know that I'm actually getting training? Because I just feel like I'm lost. One day I was on as an intern in a city hospital, and I get called stat to the emergency room for a patient who had uncontrolled bleeding. My chief resident was in the operating room, consult resident was dealing with another emergency, and guess who's next in line? The intern. So I go down to the emergency room. There is a line of ER doctors and nurses and all kinds of people there on standby. And the second I walked in, you know what they said? They said, guys, don't worry, surgery is here. And I look at them, I look behind myself, and I realize they're talking about me. I was the surgery person they're looking to for help. So right away, you put on that confident look. Confidence and the perception of knowing what you're doing is more than 90% of that battle. And I was like, I got this. Uncontrolled bleeding. I get to the bedside. Here was a man who had arteriovenous fistula that had ruptured. An arteriovenous fistula, or an AV fistula, is a connection of an artery to a vein that a vascular surgeon connects to allow for access for dialysis, commonly performed to really expedite the access and the flow of dialysis. The problem is that these connections can enlarge and can become aneurysmal, and one day, like a volcano, they can rupture. And when they rupture, it's like a garden hose of blood spurting everywhere. I walk into this room, trauma bay, and there's a machine gun of blood going boom, 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 boom throughout the room, and 4 doctors are on this patient's arm, and they couldn't control it. So right away, what happens? Your training kicks in, your instincts kick in, and you know what to do without even thinking. Proximal control, distal control. I got a red rubber catheter. I got a tourniquet, wrapped it 2 times around the artery proximally, distally, got my hands across, pulled, stopped the bleeding, clamp, and bleeding stopped within a matter of 30 seconds. 30 seconds, controlled the situation. I then asked to gain 2 large bore access peripheral IVs to now have access to give this patient blood, which they've lost in a matter of minutes. Resuscitated the patient, called for blood stat. So now we have access, we have airway control, circulation control, peripheral access, pumping blood in. We are what we call stabilizing the patient. We never take the patient to the operating room before stabilizing and resuscitating that patient. All of it learned as an intern alone. So after we kind of gave this patient blood, So return of stable vital signs without any pressor support. Patient returned to normal mental status. We had distal proximal control on that bleeding fistula. We are now from an uncontrolled situation to a controlled situation. That golden hour we have in trauma to stabilize and save that patient's life was done. Check. I call my chief resident, I tell him, ruptured AV fistula, now controlled, bleeding stopped, peripheral line access gained, blood being given to the patient. We have to take the patient to the OR, now stat. At that point, patient went to the operating room. I participated in actually repairing this fistula, putting a stent through, using a Gore-Tex mesh to fix that aneurysmal hole, and eventually saving that patient's life, all done within 1 hour. And it was at that moment I realized what intern year was all about. It was about training you to a point where your instincts take over, where your expertise is ingrained in your brain, and there is no time to think. There is no time to sort of work through something. A surgical intern moves fast at the speed of light, because if you don't, someone will die. Intern year 1, over, check. So now finally, intern year is over. I go on to my second year of residency called your consult year. And you're thinking, wow, I'm moving on to beaches and sand. I'm sipping pina coladas and I'm ready to go to the beach. Second year, I'm done with intern year. I am now a minted resident. Wrong. Consult resident year was the most challenging year I've ever had in residency. And the reason for that is that when you're a general surgery consult resident, you are the person who travels around the whole hospital, and you're the first line responder to any emergency you encounter. And believe me, you get all kinds of exotic emergencies. People who come in for gunshot wounds, stabs, pregnant women who people think are really pregnant and have some kind of a bowel problem, but are really giving birth. Patients who come in a horrible car accident, unresponsive, or burn victims who are burned from head to toe. The consult resident is, the best way of describing it is, you are dangerous enough to miss a major problem and to be actually lethal, yet not knowledgeable enough to not identify a horrible problem in the making that you can identify today. Meaning, you are not there yet, and you still have to learn. So humility is really the key. The surgical resident who's humble is the best resident. And the ones who think that they're special, think that they're God forbid, those are the ones that are really hurting people. And by hurting, I mean through neglect or through making bad judgment decisions. So second year consult resident, I'll never forget being thrown into the lion's den every day. But the difference is that now you have interns under your belt you have to watch. Throughout the day, your chief resident, that senior resident, is in the operating room. And you are the one roaming to see patients. One time I'll never forget, randomly, we're on trauma call, 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. It is myself, intern, and chief resident who's in the operating room, and we get called for a gunshot wound to the chest. Patient comes in, vital signs stable. We get notified for level 1 trauma, which we all respond to. And as I come down, we are notified mid-route on a stretcher, patients coming in with chest compressions. Now, we were told the patient was stable, but as they're rolling in, they lost vital signs. Basically, what happened was the man who was shot died en route. The heart stopped. Patient gets rolled in, EMS, doing chest compressions. And as we come in to see this patient, the ER team is there gaining access, doing a primary survey, putting a mask on the mouth, delivering oxygen, but the vital signs are not returning. There is no blood pressure, there is no heart rate. And they see a huge hole in the patient's chest from a gunshot, rip off their clothing, and they say, trauma's here, surgery's here, take over. Now they're asking me to take over my second day as a second year resident. I was an intern 2 days ago. And now they're throwing me to the lion's den of managing a patient who was shot in the chest and is virtually dead. Young 20-year-old man, not a joke. So once again, what do? We don't think, we revert to our training. Airway intact, circulation is not intact. Do our survey, listen to the chest. What do we notice? One part of the chest is not moving symmetric to the other. There's a gunshot in that wound. Listen to the chest. There are no breath sounds. The patient has a tension pneumothorax. That bullet punctured that patient's lung. The air in the lung is leaking out and is literally compressing the lung to a point where the lungs can't expand. Blood can't go into the heart. It can't be pumped out. This patient is dying or is dead unless you make him move fast. So I call for a 10-blade stat. Make that incision the fourth intercostal space. I had no time to get an instrument or to sterilize the patient because the patient was dying. I took my finger, stuck it within the patient's interscalene muscles, the rib space, found that rib, and once again, not to be graphic, stuck my finger into that lung. I felt the pleural cavity and went right into the patient's lung. The second my finger made entry into the lung, there was a mass air escape. A whoosh of air comes out of the lungs. The lungs all of a sudden expand. I literally feel them the tip of my finger. I asked the nurse to get me a chest tube stat, pour betadine to create an antiseptic field, stick that chest tube all the way into the patient's lungs, and now the lungs expand. We deliver epinephrine, continue chest compressions. And what do we see in the patient's monitor? A flat line that goes beep, beep. We reach a shockable rhythm. Boom, joules shock the patient. Heart rate comes back. Beep, 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 beep. Now blood pressure returns. Heart rate comes back up. Blood pressure returns stronger. Keep going more and more and more. We stop compressions. And what happens within 3 minutes? The patient opens their eyes and looks around the room. That patient is alive. Pneumothorax cured. Now, we carry along our primary survey, make sure there's no other injuries, make sure that bullet didn't injure anything else. However, the patient is bleeding through that chest tube. Establish peripheral access. Get blood into the patient. Call the operating room and move in stat. My first trauma, second day of my console ear, done. Patient saved, into the operating room. And let me tell you, not a bad feeling saving someone's life. Being put in that situation is scary. I was drenched in sweat. I had to change my undershirt. And, I try to keep my composure. When you're in a trauma bay and everyone's looking at you, you have to look cool. You have to look calm. You have to look like you know what you're doing. Perception is reality. But the second that trauma was done and delivered to the operating room, I snuck into a little, closet space, into clean utility room. And I was like, gasping for air, saying, thank you, God, for not making this patient die on me. That was what console ear was like. We used to respond to patients in ICUs, patients in the emergency room, patients on the regular hospital floors, and all over the hospital. The scariest part of being a console resident is the time of identifying the problem to the time of relaying that message to our attending physicians, who are kind of our bosses. They're the ones who are going to enact the care and determine if patients go to an operating room or not. That interim time is scary because we get called to other emergencies. And we have to learn how to triage and prioritize time quickly. Whether it's a cold leg, perforated viscus, like a bowel perforation, a horrible wound that has to be debrided, a leg that has to be amputated, or a patient doesn't need surgery, just needs good medical care. We have to kind of decipher very quickly on the spot and triage who needs to be seen first by our on-call surgeons. And that is a skill on its own, not just identifying a problem, but being able to triage who needs care now, who needs care within an hour, within 3 to 6 hours, or the next day. And I have to tell you, it is a daunting task, but being an intern and learning how to think quick prepared you for this moment to be able to triage quick. If you can think quickly, you can enact quickly, and you can determine who needs what quick. That second year of residency, you come out of that year not like a typical resident coming out of anything. You come out like a soldier. You are bulletproof. Nothing can penetrate you. The chief resident year of plastic surgery was the aggregate, synergistic, ultimate experience of a lifetime. It was the point in which you learn what you're made of, you learn what you can do, you realize the beginnings of your potential, and you begin to formulate who you're going to be for the next 40 years of your career. It begins in that chief resident year. And mentorship in plastic surgery at this time is extremely important. We kind of mimic our attending surgeons, people who we spend hundreds of hours with in the operating room, to sort of become pieces of what makes them great. And the beauty of being a chief resident is you can pick up skills from each individual person. If one surgeon is extremely good at doing a technical task like fixing, let's say, a tendon, another surgeon was really good at speaking to patients, being a human being, having good bedside manner. And another surgeon is really good at managing and dictating, delegating tasks to other individuals. You have the ability to take each facet of characteristics you're learning from these attending physicians and mold it into who you are and who you're going to be for the next 40 years. It is an extreme positional advantage that you can't gain almost in anything else you do in your life. The camaraderie is also highly unique, where you are operating for a prolonged period of time, being challenged to perform technical tasks that are well beyond your level of expertise. But your attending surgeons looking at you, they're saying, you're a chief resident, you have to be ready to do this, because in a matter of months, it's going to be you alone. You could be alone in the middle of the night by yourself, and you have to know how to do this. So that feeling of responsibility, the feeling of having to perform, is what makes you better. It is not the actual task of using your hands to do something, but the mentality you create in yourself that I can and I will do this. If you want to know a great lesson to learn in life, is that if you don't believe in yourself, it won't happen. But if you convince yourself that you can do something that might be a tall task, impossible task, or something where you can't do it, if you really believe in it, you will do it. You know why? Because you have done it. And it kind of culminates in chief resident year. They say in surgery, how do you eat an elephant? It's a good question to ask. How does one eat an elephant? Very simple, one bite at a time. So the principle is the same. You have to believe in yourself at every step along the way. And as you move up in those steps, as you move up the ladder, you look down and you say, holy cow, I did it. So mentors in plastic surgery, they hold your hands and pull you, if needed, up these ladders, up these stairs. And if you can't be pulled, you will drop and fall, and you'll be gone. So that, in that respect, that trial by fire, that sense of pushing and challenging is realized in the last year. Chief resident year is like all years combined into one, but much harder. I will never forget the sense of responsibility I had when I was a chief. I had junior residents under my belt, interns under my belt, rotating doctors from other programs under my belt, and visiting surgeons from other places come under my belt, and I was their boss. Preparation was key. Knowing what to do, how to perform it, how to delegate it, and how to create plans on the proper, appropriate levels of each individual person you work with is an invaluable task. Giving the intern an intern appropriate task, giving the mid-level resident an appropriate task, giving the senior resident an even more appropriate task. These are skills that are life skills, not just surgical skills, but you learn in a residency. Knowing and taking another resident through an operation was how you as the chief resident know you're ready to do surgery. The irony is you know when you're ready when you're not the one doing it. So I never forget, the first time I took an intern through a tummy tuck, an operation I performed hundreds of times. And I know you can blindfold me, I can perform this operation. Not that I will, but I know how to do it blindfolded. And taking an intern through this operation really made me think, how do I stand on the right or left of the patient so you can be on the dominant side as an intern? How do you dissect the flap, raise that skin panel up? How do you put those muscles and fix that diastasis? Elevate that skin flap, pull down, do liposuction, snatch in the sides. I could do it with my eyes closed, but to teach it was a whole new level. And this replicated over and over and over, brought you to the stratosphere of being ready to be on your own when you're an attending physician. The responsibility was awesome. I remember a time we had a patient come in, and I'm not going to give you details because you're going to tune into our other podcast episode where I'll describe the replantation of a forearm of a young, beautiful person who was caught in a horrible car accident and had an arm cut off. But after performing several operations on this young person, I remember as a chief resident, her arm started failing. And we took this patient back to the operating room in the most stressful fashion, reconnected the artery and veins. Thank God, gained back the arm. And my attending surgeon, chief of the service, said to me, if this happens again, you are fired. And I said to him, what do you mean I'm fired? I'm a chief resident. I have 6 more months left and I graduate. And he said, I don't care. If this happens again, I will fire you. I'll ruin your career. You will never practice medicine if this happens just one more time. And you know what I did? As a chief resident, I didn't mope. I didn't cry. I didn't start second guessing myself. I didn't go home. I slept in that hospital every single night for 8 days straight to make sure that that arm survived. And do you know what? The arm survived. I was very proud of that. The best thing I can tell you, as residency went by, intern year went by, residency fit completed, the chief resident year came to a completion. When I came to my last day as a chief resident, I was married, I had 2 beautiful children, and I said to myself, if I can do this, I can do anything. If I can get through all of these years, responsibility, operations, preparation, sleepless weeks, not nights, sleepless weeks, 40 hours straight on my feet, operating on people. If I can save lives, I can do anything. Residency complete. Dr. Jeremy Nikfarjam, attending plastic surgeon. Here I come.